Dear viewers and participants, talk to each other, interact with each other by using all the capabilities of our conference. You can write to potential partner investors. On the website, go to Participants tab, set the necessary categories using filters, speak the person you want to talk to from your list, and in chat, the chat should be marked. So in your personal profile, want to talk to other participants. So keep interacting in the chat in the network section, where you'll find various communications formats: general chat, topical chats, discuss projects, ideas, and meet new people. Send messages to speakers using Ask Questions button. Also share your opinions in the commentary section, and also put likes. Let me tell you about the next session. So the key trends in who'll be investing in innovations in healthcare, what startups are of interest to major industrial companies, what new partnership models, and how industrial companies look for innovations. To spend or not to spend. Biotechnology market revolution. Good afternoon, my name is Dmitry Khalilov. I'm responsible for medicine and pharma at Ernst & Young. This session is called Biotech Market Revolution. So there should be an idea, and there should be funding for it. So hopefully we'll hear about ideas from developers, designers, and represented by George Painter from Emory University, also Sean Grady, Senior Vice President for Development at AstraZeneca, financial people, Dmitry Kuzmin, Managing Partner for BioCapital, and Kirill Kaem, Senior VP for Innovations of the Skolkovo Foundation. We also have with us Lyubov Semeno-Yemelyanova from Rostelecom, Head of Project Office. So she'll tell us about digital aspects of all of that. The pandemic highlighted the importance of biotech industry. Even before that, it had no reasons to complain. It attracted a lot of interest from investors, but investments in 2020 significantly grew. According to JP Morgan, the number of rounds went up 49%, the number of IPOs by 123%, and the attractiveness of industry grew thanks to government funding. So over multiple billions of dollars were invested into vaccine development, diagnostics, etc. If we talk about public investments, that's about over 5 billion. So those numbers are fairly significant for 1 year. If we take a look at those areas of interest, besides vaccines and infections in general, it's oncology, various solutions which are platform-based, comprehensive platforms, cardiovascular diseases, also of the central nervous system, and also various developments with genes. So we see more and more of those. And also I should mention diagnostics, considering the development of AI and machine learning. Diagnostics sees more and more developments. Google announced something like that, and I think Lyubov will tell us more about this and about telemedicine as well. So let's move on, and it started with some questions. My first question is for George. George, how do you see the market and this industry 5 years going forward? Not 10 years. I cannot talk about 10 years anymore because things can drastically change in 1 year. So in the next 5 years, what trends do you see in the market? Which things will be of greatest interest? And share your experience in developing and implementing new solutions.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think 5 years, being able to project out 5 years would be miraculous, actually, because of the change in the last 6 months. But I think from the biotech perspective, over the next 5 years, there will be continued alliance with pharma. I think you've seen alliances with pharma drive response to COVID-19. I think we're seeing more, at least in the United States, of large pharmaceutical companies reaching back farther, earlier into the development process, looking for innovation. I think that will be the trend. There's been exuberance in the marketplace in 2020, as you saw. I think that's starting to moderate a bit, at least it is here. I mean, if you check the Wall Street Journal this morning and see that SPACs are trading under $10 a share, I think that more of a trend of fundamentals, more of a trend of startups being driven by total accessible markets will be the trend.
Okay, thank you. May I ask one more question? If I just move to the patent situation now in the vaccine world, actually, some of the governments, they're asking for the remove of the protection from the vaccine drugs, but this is the very costly for the companies for the research, etc. What do you think? What would be here the balance between the opening the patents, and should be there are some, what kind of the approach should be undertaken in this area?
Well, I'll leave it to Sean to talk about vaccines and patents, but I think the issue of patents in general, it's been a question for at least 10 years. Look, under severe circumstances, there's process for negotiating voluntary licenses, or if that's not possible and it's deemed in the interest of national security of a country, there's mandatory licensing. I think what happened in the United States, actually, an endorsement for suspension of intellectual property rights was not well considered, actually doesn't address the problem, and I don't think that's going to provide incentive. I mean, when you think about the money that has to be invested, somehow there has to be a way to recoup it. So I think we should try to adhere to the process that's in place, negotiating voluntary licenses when possible, which actually we're experiencing now is happening in India. So I have to say that I'm just not an advocate of suspension of intellectual property rights across the board.
Thank you, George. Следующий вопрос я хочу.
So the next question is for Sean. Sean, you represent a large pharma company. So can you share with us how a pandemic impacted your company, AstraZeneca, and your developments? So has the focus shifted, and what is your current priority?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the program today. It's delightful to be here. Yeah, I mean, as regards the pandemic, the way we think about it is it hasn't really resulted in a huge strategic shift. We still focus on oncology, cardiovascular, renal, metabolic, and respiratory and immunology medicines. And people may know we're in the process of completing the acquisition of Alexion in order to also move into rare diseases. So the strategic focus remains unchanged. But what has happened is that the pandemic has brought around an acceleration of the delivery of that strategy, particularly in connection with digitalization. So during the course of the pandemic, I mean, perhaps the first thing to say is that another key part of our strategy is partnering and collaboration. And that continued really unchanged as a result of the containment measures. And I think that's a credit to my colleagues in AstraZeneca, but to colleagues in life sciences and pharma generally. We all kept the momentum going in terms of partnering. And in our case, we were able to put in place a risk share, cost share, co-development, co-commercialization collaboration with Daiichi Sankyo for deal terms in the region of $6 billion. And we did that without ever meeting. So the entirety of the negotiation took place remotely. And the reason that was able to happen was because we had good personal and organizational links with Daiichi. So all the time that we've all spent at conferences and symposia and events like this, building up those personal relationships stood us in good stead when it came to deal making on a remote and virtual basis. So credit to business development people. I would say that, wouldn't I, for keeping the boat moving. And then the other area that we would point to would be the conduct of clinical trials, where, again, we managed to keep the main programs moving forward through increased digitization. And, you know, in particular, drug delivery to patients at home, not having to come into a central spot, virtual patient monitoring and remote monitoring generally, and patients themselves reporting their outcomes, which is going to simplify the trial procedures and make clinical trial conduct more burdensome for patients. So we get earlier data and additional insights. So, you know, no huge strategic change or shift, but certainly the pandemic has operated as an accelerant. And partnering has been key and core. I mean, if you think about the AstraZeneca's role in the pandemic, is best known for the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine, which of course was the product of partnering with Oxford and with Biotech. And you know, in terms of the progress that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is making, some people may have seen that the Minister of Health here in the UK made an announcement 2 or 3 days ago that of the 1.5 billion vaccine doses that have been administered around the world, 400 million of those are the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which has been administered in over 160 countries. And 2/3 2/3 of those 400 million units were administered to people in low and middle income countries, and importantly and proudly for us, on a not-for-profit basis. So, George touched on it also. The pandemic has concentrated and focused the importance of partnership and much more public-private partnership and partnering with people that you wouldn't previously particularly knock around with.
Шон, спасибо, очень интересно.
Thank you, Sean. That was very interesting. So speaking of partnerships, you mentioned a lot about that. AstraZeneca, one of the companies where we see partnerships everywhere. In development of vaccines, which was done with the Oxford University, your partnership in production in multiple countries, you partner with local producers, including Russia. You continue to develop vaccines. You develop it in different countries, and in Russia too. It's no secret that you continue to work on a vaccine by being combined. So in this partnership, what is more important for you, and how do you make decisions? In what format? What should be the format of this partnership going forward? So is there a geographic approach to determining where your innovation activities should take place, where you are looking for new partners, and where your R&D centers will be placed?
Yes, so we firmly believe that partnering and collaboration is just inherent and essential for innovation. And secondly, we believe that innovation is global, and good ideas are everywhere and anywhere, which isn't how big pharma used to think about things 10 years ago. Longer, 15 years ago, we thought we had the best science and the best scientists. But now, if you look at everybody's pipelines and portfolio, probably, 40% of people's pipelines originated from outside the big pharma companies. We have 3 strategic hubs in AstraZeneca, in the US, the UK, and Sweden, because of our kind of legacy heritage. But we actually also have 20 innovation hubs under the brand of A-Catalyst around the world that are looking to identify and amplify innovation in all the different markets that we operate in a very distinguished, unique manner that's required by the patient need in those particular markets. So we try and have tentacles everywhere, and that includes in Russia with the Skolkovo Foundation, and we partner and participate in programs like this because we firmly believe we have a duty to support the ecosystem and the development of new innovation that we can potentially partner with, but actually for the benefit of mankind more broadly. So we have over 180 live, active collaborations globally, and pretty much everywhere in the world. So it is partnering and business development. It is a global activity.
Спасибо, Шон. Дмитрий,
Thank you very much. Dmitry, the next question is for you. So how do you see this partnership between investors and developers? So being a venture investor, how do you select your projects? At what stage do you prefer to enter those projects? So can you tell us what happens behind the scenes in this industry?
It's a pleasure to be here. I refer back to what Sean said. Actually, a very sizable proportion of the pharma pipelines around the world today originate within venture-backed biotechs. And if you look at the approval statistics over the past 10 years, actually, for every approved drug that's been approved from within a big pharma, so fully developed in-house, an average of 4.8 have been originated within a private a venture capital-backed biotech, but actually a very large proportion of these get in-licensed by the big pharma. So naturally, there's an ongoing partnership between the three corners of the ecosystem: the academia, who develop the translational science and innovation that goes into these new therapies, the big pharma, who have the capability, typically only they have the capability, to market these drugs and actually bring them to patients, and then the developmental biotech community, supported by the venture capital funds that provide the resources, the connections, quite often the brainpower as well, to develop these. And so as we view the ecosystem and position ourselves within the ecosystem, it's important for us to understand what kind of innovations are required by the market. And so where is the real unmet medical need, as we call it, that we can address? And more specifically for a fund like for Bio, which is a technologically focused fund, also what is the unmet technological need? Where are the gaps that we can identify and look at? And so in our particular case, we're a venture creation fund, so about 40 to 50% of everything we do is building companies from the ground up based on European university-based research. And the rest is typical seed and Series A financing. And so as we look at the technological challenges and the unmet medical needs in this space, we utilize our own proprietary technological strategy to go and source answers to those unmet medical needs within primarily European academia. And so as we consider opportunities for investment, there are a number of things that are critical. First and foremost, is this useful? Is this really necessary? Is there a patient need? As we're an advanced therapies only investor, we typically focus on gene, cell, and RNA therapies that address very dire unmet medical needs in often rare, but not necessarily, but definitely very hard to treat conditions. And so unmet medical need is the first guiding principle. The second is robust proof of concept data. You would very often hear people asking venture capital funds, oh, what's the typical point at which you'd invest? And that is actually a question with no simple answer. And especially for early stage funds like ourselves, the answer to that, it depends. So the key criterion for us is that the proof of concept data we're looking at preclinically should be appropriate to both the therapeutic modality and the therapeutic indication in question. You wouldn't go chasing gene therapies off the back of in vitro data. Conversely, cell therapy in cancer in vitro has been very strong and it's quite validating. So from this perspective, number two, appropriate proof of concept data. Number three, intellectual property protection. Outside of orphan diseases where you can get a bit of protection without a patent, everywhere else, and even in them, IP protection is paramount. Without a patent, global rights is very, very challenging to do something. And sadly, the issue of IP contamination by inadvertent disclosure remains a constant plaguing issue, both for European and American academia. Quite often. And then the two remaining risks or issues you'd look at are A, the team. Is there a credible academic behind the whole endeavor? Do we understand how to source the talent? Is there talent? Does anybody in the world understand how to build these cells, viruses, molecules? Do we understand how to work with this? And then the last, but unfortunately often disregarded, but a very important question is refinancing risk. Will this company, the startup, this project, be able to reach a credible de-risking event, a credible milestone with the amount of capital they're raising and that we're able to provide? And thus, will they de-risk themselves substantially enough to raise the next round of financing? So these four things, unmet medical need, adequate proof of concept, intellectual property, and team, and on top of that, the refinancing risk, constitute the bulk of any due diligence process that you'd see a venture capital fund or a big pharma partner do on more or less any early stage biotech.
Дмитрий, интересно, вот вы и Шон отметили
Dmitry, you and Sean have highlighted the rare diseases. In 2020, we saw that the investment into rare diseases has been declining. Maybe it's due to the moment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Or did it have some additional factors? I know that in Russia, the government is focusing on rare diseases. We have the foundation, the Circle of Kindness, which is treating the rare illnesses. What do you think? Could it be a trend which is going to come back? I mean, the investments into rare diseases, or are we losing something, missing something here?
First of all, I would say that we haven't detected in any way, shape, or form a decrease in attention to rare disease. If we look at the advanced therapies field in particular, remember the first drug approval we've had in advanced therapies with Exondys 51 was in 2016. Since then, we've had 17 new drug approvals in 5 years, which is incredible in its own right. All of these have been in rare diseases. And last year, in the advanced therapy space alone, we've seen $19 billion in investment across private and public markets. And so this is an all-time high. I wouldn't say there's been a pullback in any shape or form. Now, there's also an important thing to consider strategically and long-term: are rare diseases attractive and sustainable? Can we contemplate now $1 million price tag or a $2.3 million price tag, as in Zolgensma? Is this really a commercial and sort of business model that can go forward? And the answer to this is yes and no. There is a lot of finance innovation and innovation on behalf of the payers, both single-payer healthcare systems like in the UK, as well as insurance-based healthcare systems such as in the US, to be able to accommodate one-time, potentially curative, relatively expensive therapies within their payment frameworks, which is not something that we've dealt with before. So there's definitely some infrastructure challenges to rare disease treatments and novel rare disease treatments, but the fact that, for example, with gene therapy, we've been able to cure outright or demonstrate something that looks very much like a phenotypic cure in 11 previously untreatable rare genetic diseases is a fantastic fundamental human achievement. It's again, incredible. And as somebody who's spent now close to 18 years in the gene therapy field, I think that it's been fascinating to watch. So from this perspective, I think that going forward, rare diseases will remain the theme. We've just scratched the surface. There are tens of thousands of them that we know about, and way more of them we actually haven't detected yet, but we understand vaguely what they are from the genomics perspective. But perhaps more importantly, they're a stepping stone. We need the stepping stone to be able to refine these technologies, to be able to manufacture for a patient 100,000 the same gene therapy virus or cell therapy that we can for the patient 10,000 and patient 1. We need to demonstrate these are safe, robust, reliable, and scalable. And only with that can we take these novel modalities into where we'd like to take them, which is into large-scale chronic diseases that represent systemic burdens on healthcare systems. So going forward, I think that rare disease innovation will definitely keep being very, very important for the next 20 or 30 years. But until we're able to cure most genetic diseases, which will take quite some time. But these definitely are stepping stones to pouring more resources into what I call medium rare diseases, and then perhaps going a bit further than that.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, it's an interesting question to answer when AstraZeneca is in the process of making a $39 billion acquisition of Alexion to expand our portfolio into rare disease. You can take from that we're firm believers in the opportunity and the patient need in rare disease. We're in this sort of regulatory competition law approval process. You know, I shouldn't say too much about it because of the so-called gun jumping regulations, but you know, we see scientific complementarity between Alexion's portfolio and our own. And we also see significant opportunity to expand geographically using AstraZeneca's commercial footprint to bring the Alexion portfolio to patients, particularly, but not only in China.
Yeah, I'd like to say something to follow on about that too, if I may. I mean, I think Dimitri hit something. There's a balance. And when you're trying to finance a biotech and you go to investors, they're looking for total accessible market because that underpins ultimately the value. A total accessible market is a product, isn't it, of two numbers. One, the number of patients, and two, the cost that third-party payers will bear paying for that. And I think that dynamic is coming to play. We're spinning out another biotech right now, Altessa, and we're going through the fundamentals with investors, and this issue of total accessible market does come up. And it comes up when we're trying to interface back to pharma too. So I don't know what the landscape is going to be for reimbursement for treatments for rare diseases where there's small number of patients. And in order to develop the drug reasonably, there has to be rather a high price put on it. So I think this dynamic is going to play out both publicly, particularly with the new administration in the US and the pressure on third-party payers here. But it will ring down to the financing of biotechs without a question.
George, can you please share more on your experience on the development? Because you are leading the development institute.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year. I think that we started in January out licensing a drug for influenza that was broad spectrum and had activity against highly pathologic coronaviruses. That's driven the past 14 months of our lives. Well, I don't know how many, maybe 12, but it's gone quickly. But that development process and the pandemic has really impacted how regulators interact with drug developers. We worked both in the US with the FDA and the UK with the HMPA. It's been a good dynamic. I think going forward, particularly with these viral diseases, even rare occurrence ones, that a big outcome out of this is that a primary clinical endpoint will be viral burden, which I started my career working on herpes and HIV, which was a big battle. Now I think that will move to the fore. That will impact development time. That will impact cost of development. As I said, we're spinning out a company now, Altessa, focused on RNA viral diseases. I guess some of those would have been classified as rare. What we choose to develop as a gateway to get an approval into a larger accessible market with a broad spectrum drug. I think that's going to play out over the year. How that occurs is also going to impact financing. There are several companies in the US that are working on that we're following. I guess that's a bit of a far-ranging answer, but I don't think you should underestimate the impact of the past 12 months on going forward, particularly as it relates to the interaction with regulators and how value building is perceived by underlying investors.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, what we see in the market also among some of the globalization, we see some of the localization trends actually go back to protect their own countries, to protect their own citizens first. Just overall, what do you think would be the serious impact for the investors from government approach in this respect?
Well, I think I think Sean touched it. This is a global business. And I think there are some strong connections globally, particularly in the area of infectious disease. You can't address all the problems sitting in an office in Atlanta, Georgia, that are attendant upon the health burden in the world. Yes, there's been some protectionism, but I will point out that when perception of national security is strong enough that countries will react, and countries have reacted. And I think this will stimulate a little more collegial and a little more formal interaction on making sure medicines are distributed under severe public health or pandemic conditions. But otherwise, I think I agree, it's business as usual. It's a global business. And I think with internet connections, personal connections, again, that are built through interactions like this, ultimately will win the day. I mean, I will point out, this isn't anything new. When we had H1N1 pandemic in the US in 2009, there was a shortage of Tamiflu here because Indian generic manufacturers held back so there was enough for their country. So again, I think rather than having an impact on the discovery of development, that might have an impact on local sites of production. But I can't emphasize enough that this is a global business and these global interactions.
George, I'd echo that. I think people will look very closely at the security of their supply chain, and that might, result in a bit of retrenching. And then, the other thing we think about, or my colleagues think about, is the sort of localization of ecosystems, perhaps with people traveling less, with climate change concerns, that people will look closer to home first than perhaps we've done in the past. So, it's not straightforward, is it? And there are a number of, on the face of it, contradictions.
Yeah, in the paper here, if you look at it, there you'll see this dynamic. Half the papers to say we're facing deglobalization, and that precisely as you say, there'll be a localization of infrastructure and process, and the other half say no, we'll go back.
Which makes programs like Skolkovo and the network and the interactions that creates, which kind of bridges both. So it's local, it's Russia, it's Moscow focused, but it brings together, informed, thoughtful people from around the world is probably a model we should nurture and cherish.
Amen.
I think we can ask Kirill now, to comment on the Skolkovo side. Kirill, мы услышали про зеленый международный.
Yes, we have heard the green experience of the world, the trends approach, and we already can see a serious level of investment into biotechnologies on an international scale. However, in Russia, venture financing in this field is not too developed somehow. Could you please share your opinion? Maybe you see the reasons and maybe you know how to change the situation for the better. Yes, let's try to make a step back. The session is called to spend or not to spend, but we're talking about to invest or not to invest. So, and this is all about investments. Whoever is spending money on medical technologies, whether it is state or it's a venture investors or the private investors or the strategic ones, everything is all about investing into the future. And we live in a very interesting period, 2020 and 2021. Of course, the colleagues see how rare diseases are important here and now, and indeed, from the point of view of technologies, we are developing more and more specialized treatment means and products. However, the pandemic situation which we have faced, and Mr. Painter has mentioned that as well, so it leads to a more global approach and a more drastic one from the point of view of infectious diseases. And the paradox is, we do understand that a very significant chunk of developments which are coming to the vaccines and vector vaccines, which are saving humankind here and now, and we really hope that they are saving the humankind, of course. They were born in the labs, not during the pandemic, but they had their foundation laid about 10, 20 years ago. For some companies, the results were obvious, and it was very successful. And I saw that due to pandemic, $9 billionaires have appeared in the world. Usually we're talking about biotech, so the one which is creating the vaccine, and Robert Langer from Moderna was one of the founders of RNK technology, which is creating the vaccine by Moderna. But we can also hear the voices, and I really don't support them actually in most of the cases, that the current pandemic has shown that nationalization of the intellectual property is going to be very important. And of course we forget to say that if we do it now, if something happens in 7-10 years, we won't have any new technologies. Why I speak about it here and now? Because the question, invest or not to invest, bears a simple answer: yes, invest. And of course, investments have to come from both the government and the private investors. But the investors in the biomedical technologies, the investments should be done by the intellectual people and very patient one. We can see few examples when people are investing and they are not specialized in various segments of biomedical technologies. Secondly, we still need to wait for the result for quite some time. But I would actually like to take three groups of technologies. We have developers here and investors, as far as I can tell, and I would divide things into three parts. The parts are rather simple. First, the drugs and the vaccines. We have been talking about a lot about that. This is medical technologies, the classic one, new equipment, new devices. And third, the digital solutions, which are very hypey in medicine, and they might become a great lever. If we take a look at those three groups, the characteristics are changing, the characteristics which are affecting the investment attractiveness, starting from global down to the local ones. So if we're talking about the drugs, so these are the global things requiring the international strategy to be successful in the market. The scale effect is most important for such developments due to its expensiveness.
Medtech can be either global or local. If we talk about digital developments, there are good examples of that. So that are totally local. Time to market, same thing. Digital technologies make it shorter. So except for such cases as the pandemic, and also specialization of investors. Normally, when we talk about investing into drugs or vaccines, those are highly specialized investment funds with serious expertise in the funds, or maybe from the universities, those who understand the subject matter well, and digital solutions that with multiple investors. So 3 years ago they had no idea they were going to invest in that, and these days they invest into medical sphere. So these issues define whether it's going to be a global success or a local success, and it impacts how we support those technologies. If we talk about development of drugs, we work with a strategic investor who's next to us, in partnership with us, and who's on board with us, and it helps us to get necessary competencies, get it from the strategic investors, and select proper startups at early stages that develop drugs. And we understand clearly well that as a fund, without a strategist that is able to push those technologies to We will not be able to find a private investor or to provide funding ourselves. And digital solutions are found among private companies. That's really fairly simple. So at an early stage, people can invest their even personal money because they know how to do it. If you talk about regulation, so the situation changed dramatically last year, and the Russian government's resolution helped to introduce therapies and medical devices in an accelerated way. Those who were there to fight the pandemic. I could cite some examples. Exactly. I wanted you to provide some examples how you worked with the regulator, because the colleagues, George and Sean, they talked about voluntary and mandatory licensing and about existing institutions. So it's like back privatization, reverse privatization. We know it works. It was used in Russia. So can you show your experience, how you can link, how you put together the government, the regulator, investors, developers? Perhaps Skolkovo has some accelerators, and you've been through this. Accelerators create networks, and they create a platform for communications. But one way or the other, there's no universal solution for all startups. And also to overcome regulatory barriers using a special startup tunnel, it just does not exist. Every time we understand a company is close to the stage of maturity when they need a permit from the regulator, it is manual work. We take that company to the regulator and we discuss how their registration of that drug will be done by the regulator. And sometimes it's a paradoxical situation. So the regulator, when there's a new innovative drug, so they say a dossier, a clinical trial should be designed, and we see some requirements that exceed 2 times compared to similar drugs produced by major corporations. They say, why? Because the risks are higher. So, but the mechanisms and clinical data are good, but you need to work on those issues manually. So, speaking of examples, those companies that used that resolution 441, so among them Interlogic is here. It has a booth here, by the way. So in terms of attracting investments, it's one of the largest medical startup. It has Botkin AI, that's their solution. And Pharmadiol, another resident of Skolkovo, anticoagulant drugs, which are also used for COVID treatment. So they also use the resolution of the government 441 for accelerated process. A rapid bio, it's about COVID tests and antibodies, so quick tests that don't require special reader devices. So you can do it at home and you can understand. So by taking a sample from your nose, whether you currently have the coronavirus infection or not. And Madam Popova stated from Rospotrebnadzor that basically it's an alternative to PCR, and Rospotrebnadzor is willing to accept it. So we are moving forward with our colleagues. But here's the issue. On the one hand, the regulator simplifies that, makes it cheaper. But on the other hand, like Dmitry said, the downside is this mandatory licensing. And unfortunately, those companies that went through this accelerated process are so they may be the same ones that need this mandatory licensing. So we don't want this to become a standard once the pandemic is over. And just as before, those developers that do a lot of intellectual work to develop drugs, they should lay the foundation for the future, otherwise we'll be in a vacuum. So there are some great examples of voluntary licensing. For instance, for India, we spoke a lot about digital technologies and diagnostics, and Lyubov is here with us, and she can tell us a lot about digitalization, considering the fact that Rostelecom developed a platform for online communication with doctors, and with Rostec, they launched Rostelemed to develop various medical solutions in the digital sphere. So why did you get interested in that? Good afternoon. Let me get started about Rostelecom's position. Rostelecom creates healthy, comfortable, environmental living environment. And in that environment, human beings should be healthy. We started to work with medicine and running first pilots in 2018 and 19. So Kirill mentioned some foundations. So we saw some of those B2C and B2B, how people, whether they're ready to perceive telemedicine, if they're willing to pay for it or not. So we started to look at different aspects. You have digital, comfortable situations for management companies, etc. And how do you make it comfortable for people? It became more clear for us. Of course, it's about business. Another trendy thing is not to develop something necessarily new, but there can be business segments for Rostelecom where we can generate income by providing our influence and influencing people's lives. So it started not only with digital companies, but also with others, and also digitalization of medicine and digitalization of industry. So here we're discussing biotech. So it is at the interface of industry and medicine. So it's the same thing for us, but also a different thing. Some pharmaceuticals companies can be automated in terms of their production facilities. And another thing is when a digital platform can be offered by us to different companies. We have automation. And besides digital platforms for telemedicine, on the government services portal, we also introduced this aspect of diagnostics for patients and also for oncological diseases at early stages. So among startups, we were looking for a technology that would make it possible with breast imaging to identify breast cancer, to increase the probability of early identification or early detection. So it was difficult because many work with cases and they train their neural networks on using digital images, but we had a lot of images on film. So these days digital images are used, but we have archives. So AI can properly learn from that, and we can facilitate the work of physicians. And some things can be given him as an advice. So you need to work not only with digital images, but also with film images. So second thing, about comfortable diagnostics. If our system helps to reduce time required from a doctor and we make his job easier, It is very important, not only in government or clinics, but also in private clinics. Everybody thinks that main client of Rostelecom is the state. It's not true. About 75% of legal entities, one way or the other, are our clients. So we talk about private companies here. If we both in medical sphere and in the industrial sphere. In terms of trends, whether to spend or not to spend, in the past, we had Ciframed, RTK Автоматика, RTK Radiologia, and maybe one day RTK Biotech will become a reality. If there's a demand, if there's interest for businesses, so we would be able to add value to people's lives, then it is possible. If we talk about working with end users, unfortunately, we are willing to use digital products, but we do not like paying for them. So when we talk about digitalization, it's B2B and B2C if we talk about business. And of course, we look not only at platforms, basic platforms, foundational platforms, but there are some unique and specialized platforms. If we talk about diagnostics, we see that everybody is able to do lungs imaging. But if we talk about some pathologies, when we talk about throat imaging, it's much more complicated. Very few can provide good results on that imaging. If we talk about traumatology, it's a different niche as well. So when you work with AI, with digital startups that provide those digital services, we need to look at this, and we look at them. We participate in accelerators. So a medical accelerator is running now with the Skolkovo Foundation and with AstraZeneca and other partners. And I can tell you that the companies that participate in the accelerator, in a month and a half, we've been interacting with them very closely. So I've been speaking for quite a while. I can tell you quite a bit on this, about digital and biotech technologies. I wonder if you have any questions. Yeah, I have some comments, and then I have a question considering the remaining time. You talked about end user, and Google recently announced the launch of a digital solution for skin diseases. So that's for end users. I don't know what kind of format, how payment will be done, but considering Google's track record, they will find a way to monetize it. I can tell you, those projects are based on a large database of images to teach neural networks on specific diseases. So that's about taking pictures of various areas of the skin, and then they look at average statistics, also incidence of specific skin diseases in the States or in that specific area. I agree with you. And in fact, we can do that in Russia as well, but so far we don't have such a fashion to share our diseases with others. And telemedicine, to tell the truth, made it possible for people without visiting doctors get consultations on their conditions. The average Russian person, they don't like seeing doctors, only when they feel bad. So So if you have a woman who's over 50, so breast imaging is not something they want to do. So if there's an app that helps people to interact in a confidential manner so that their relatives would not learn about it, that they consulted a doctor about some condition, it's easier to visit, to see their relative, not to go to see their doctor. So we make it more comfortable for the people. We look at their psychology, their mentality. In not all the regions, they have relevant medical institutions in place. So that helps them to save the time, even for ambulances. So the time they spend traveling to those villages, we can reduce it, or it's not even needed. So we make lives of our people easier and make life easier for our medical personnel and those who are involved in health services and healthcare in general. Thank you for that, Lyubov. And one last question today to all of the speakers. Just briefly, what steps should be made now so that venture funding would be more interesting for Russia, for startups to invest here in Russia? So while I'm having the microphone, I will try to respond right away. You need to have a product, and the market should be understandable, and also the person who is involved with the startup should understand what is it they're doing in terms of funding. Every company or corporation in Russia has some key areas they focus on. All the corporations and all the public companies have those things on their websites. You can find them. So, and also contact people are there. It's on their websites. Especially throughout this last year, we were able to invest into their capital and we were able to create joint ventures. So if you have the money, you can work. So we're coming to an end of this session, and I should thank all the participants. So, do we have a minute, Kirill? Yes, I will be very quick. In fact, this situation is far from being great. Just like in other segments in healthcare, so successful venture funding is a market issue. It's about that can be done by anybody, a Rostelecom or a small venture fund or a special venture fund with funding from the Ministry of Industry and Trade. This is a painful issue. Still, it's an open issue. Strategists that are able to provide strategic investments, especially for the development of drug. So there are very few. In Russia, there are very few. So that's the first problem. And the second problem, we need not only strategists who can do those investments, but those strategists need to have international ambitions. So the global component, especially if you do drug development, it is key. Unfortunately, with government support, and it works like that around the world, you cannot get very far. You should have special investment institutions, venture funds among them, and we're getting there little by little. So 5 years ago, if we compare to where we are today, of course we have progress. But to get there, when Pharma 2020 that brought their production to the Russian Federation and incentivized local production, now local producers, if they start develop their R&D, if they're doing M&A with startups, if they buy licenses, it may take 10 years, something like that. But we see examples of that less than 10 years, Kirill, because it's already happening. Yeah, there's some examples of that, but the market, it hasn't been developed yet. George, Sean, Miller, small comments from you.
If you're thinking about making the Russian market attractive to global VC, which it needs to become if it is indeed to become a global market, then there are two critical components here. One is rule of law and protection of private property, and this is really important, paramount, and it applies also to intellectual property, and this is very important. Compulsory licensing and things like those are large geographic risks that keep venture capital away, and this important needs to be considered. And then the second component is the pipeline itself. Unfortunately, life sciences investing is dependent on translational science. It's dependent on there being enough new molecules, new gene therapies, new cell therapies, new diagnostics, and so on and so forth. And whilst there is very strong health tech and emerging med tech, despite a relatively strong history of life sciences, the volume of life sciences research is just insufficient at this point in time. So the second thing that needs growth and support, and it needs support both from the public funding sources as well as strategic partnerships, as well as charitable organizations and trusts, is funding life sciences research. This is the way that you build over the long term, because the VC is the upper segment of the pyramid. You need to build out the bottom of the pyramid, the foundation, in order to spur the downstream development. So these are the two things that are necessary if you think long term.
Yeah, I would agree with what Dmitry just said, that translational science is the foundation. In the United States, there's an enormous sovereign investment that drives innovation to a point where it can be defined as translational science, meaning that it's near a point where there's adequate data to justify private investment. I think that's critical. And then as to the second point, ensuring the integrity of the investment by way of making sure that international law is followed. I'm in the middle of a big fight right now over voluntary versus compulsory licensing. I think that's important, and ensuring adequate protection of intellectual property. So without some sort of financial incentive for the people that put large sums of money at risk. And by the way, now in the US, there's a shift over to hedge funds, large hedge funds coming in early. But everybody's going to need some insurance as to the integrity of the property and the integrity of their investment.
So I'd add two things too. The first is that at the end of the day, it's all about the science. So, if you have innovation that's going to make a meaningful difference to patients' lives, then that should and will emerge and attract money and attract people to build a team around that. And then secondly, I'd say, don't underestimate the amount of help and assistance and support that's available across the ecosystem, whether it's big pharma like AZ, coaching and mentoring. Everybody is in and around the clusters to help mutual success. So really tap into those networks, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the goodwill and generosity of time and commitment that is actually available to emerging companies.
Благодарю всех участников. Тема оказалась настолько интересной и горячей, что мы даже вышли за пределы нашего времени.
Thank you very much. The topic became so heated that we actually got out of the timeline. But thank you very much for your attention.
температурах окружающей среды тела быстро теряют энергию. Но нахождение вблизи источника тепла позволяет телу получать тепловое излучение. Происходит самопроизвольное перераспределение тепла. Следовательно, когда источники тепла находятся вместе, их энергия побеждает холод. Лучшее создается вместе. Газпромбанк.
МТС Стартап Хаб. Работа с реальным бизнес-заказчиком МТС. Доступ к ресурсам самого крупного телеком-бренда в России. Не можешь поверить? А в твой стартап обязательно поверят. У нас есть все, что тебе понадобится. Ресурсы, клиенты, технологии, каналы продаж. Мы оценим твой продукт, правильно применим в своем бизнесе и масштабируем на мировой рынок. МТС Стартап Хаб ждет тебя и твоих нереальных бизнес-идей.